Thank you, Sanjana, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Pedigree, for the kind invitation. So, I would like to start the presentation by asking um a question that you actually can think of. Maybe towards the end of the session, this fundamental question will help you to decide whether phenomenology is the right design for you. Okay. Um, as a human being, how important do you think your experiences to be contributed into a phenomenon? So that is a question that you have to ask yourself and predominantly to ask others when you actually wanting to start off or doing or thinking about doing phenomenology. Okay, so let me share my slides uh, to allow you to learn more about it. Wait for a while, yeah, because I have to start at the first page and then we go back to Zoom. Okay, right. We go back to Zoom. I hope everybody can see my slides. Sorry, I'm still okay. I hope you can still see my slides. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. This is Phenomenology 101. Basically, um, I'm going to introduce to you the fundamentals of phenomenology. Okay. Um, why phenomenology? For me myself, I always wanted to learn from other people's experiences. So that is one of the fundamental reasons as to why I, at the end, decided to adopt phenomenology out of all the possible qualitative design that can be adopted to a particular research. Okay. So in the presentation, I will basically provide an introduction, maybe also put some definition and key concepts before I delve into data collection, data analysis, trustworthiness, and rigor and applications of phenomenology. So before I begin, again, basically, if you are moving forward or thinking about phenomenology, you have to have a keen interest to understand other people's experiences in understanding one specific phenomenon. If that is basically the way to go, you can consider doing phenomenology. So basically, phenomenology is a research design that is focusing on the essence of human experiences. And it basically pioneered by Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And basically, when you are uncovering essence of human experiences, you have to understand that it is providing subjective meaning from one person to another person. And these experiences collectively are his or her lived experiences, right? And the aim of conducting phenomenology study is to have rich, detailed insights. Because as I've mentioned before, right? Human essences are differs from one person to another. So with this in mind, you are expected to gain rich data. You are expected to gain what is their subjectivity in experiencing the mentioned phenomenology, right? So basically, what I like most about exploring phenomenology um, in specific is basically um, It goes beyond just understand human behavior. It's basically trying to understand them in their own element and let them tell their story to you, their experience to you. This is the definition. So basically, as I mentioned, it is popularized and led by Edmund Husserl, and basically, it is um, a notion or a focus that making subjectivity a conscious first-person experiences, right? And then it is also um, a research design that allows subjectivity and rigorous process go hand in hand. Out of the main five um, qualitative research design described by John Creswell, for instance, John Creswell mentioned that phenomenology has the most fluidity out of the five design that he discussed, but it still has a proper process to actually allow the researchers to conduct the research in a structure that is promoting rigor and trustworthiness. Okay, so basically, in phenomenology, we did not only discuss about their interpretations of experiences. It exudes emotion, cultural backgrounds, and what that means when them experience the phenomenon that they are in. Right? So again, it is all about human experiences. It's fundamental and universal, but it provides variation because, as I've mentioned, humans experience things rather differently as it is influenced by different factors and level of exposures. So this actually provides um, our understanding based on subjective lived experiences. And this subjectivity allows the researchers to capture nuances, complexities, to understand multiple structures. Basically, it goes beyond perception, embodiment, time, relationships, and other items that provide meaning to the experience, right? But what make phenomenology have some structure and that researchers are able to actually reflect back on is basically through journaling, through fact, through member checking, through other means of making sure that the items are valid, right? So in qualitative, we don't call validity and reliability as reliability and validity. We coin them as rigor and trustworthiness. And for you to undergo these processes, it will allow the researcher to go iteratively back and forth, reflectively and effectively. The key concepts. So, first, you have to have the intention to actually understand human experiences and understand their meanings. You have to understand their intention for providing action to something because you have to make sense of their experiences, right? For certain type of phenomenology, bracketing or epoching is basically separating your own beliefs, your own assumptions, your own biases from the actual research process. This is done particularly if you are actually applying transcendental phenomenology by excluding yourself from the experience. You are purely depending on what is the experience in meaning making of your informants. right? For example, in my PhD, I decided to use transcendental phenomenology due to the fact that if I put my own experience into the analysis or into the design, I may put my biasness on, because before I was doing my PhD, I was a practicing journalist. I was also a PR practitioner. I was also a columnist, community columnist. So with that experience, I have that concern. If I were not, if I was not conducting bracketing and I was not doing enough journaling, I would actually become biased because of my vast experience in actually understanding citizen journalism. Because I have been in both sides of the spectrum, right? Either professionally or non-professional. And then in phenomenology, either you are doing transcendental or are you doing a fully interpretive phenomenology? Phenomenal reduction is basically essential. But regardless of whether you are selecting a specific type of phenomenology or a general type of phenomenology, it has to actually um, have a phenomenological reduction, because otherwise you would have a very vast rich data that you cannot contextualize accordingly, right? So to get to the core of the essence, the reduction must happen. And to get to the underlying structures and the meanings, you need to actually go to the phenomenological reduction to understand a particular context. Let's say, for example, my study about phenomenology is basically the citizen journalism phenomenon in Malaysia. So I have done the phenomenological reduction by a certain process that I would explain to you later, right? To ensure that they are contextual understanding from the mass amount of information that I got from my 14 informants. And basically, we will go through that later, a little bit later. And then these are the items that you need to know, and you need to also understand these are the items that you need to be aware of, right? So you need to understand that people expose and understand the world differently. What I mean by that is they have different meanings as per to their practices, experience, cognition, right? And the person and the world, because the thing is, like, if you start to interview someone, let's say, for example, one person can give you a 30-minute first interview, but another person can give you 1 hour value of interview. So the question of how far you can get to a person's lived experience objectively relatively depend on what is the contents of the interview intended. It's not about the length, it's about how the person actually described his or her experiences and how he or her understand the world. Basically, um, it also make us reflect on our own perception and reflect assumptions and preconceptions as a researcher. And this is why I basically avoid myself or perform a bracketing from my phenomenological process, because uh, the item number two, which is person and world, I don't want things to be collided between my experience and their experiences. And then points of continuum of the lived experiences, right? So in this actual point, You can actually know that everybody has their own knowledge based on their experiences. But these knowledges, right? Um, not all of them we can uncover. We can only focus on their thoughts, um, feelings, and practices that they want to show you, that they can describe and they can interpret it. They can help us interpret it, right? And from these 3 points, it provides the license for you to explicate the deeper human aspects of a situation, attending to mood, sensation, and emotions. So when it comes to phenomenology, sometimes, yeah, when it is required, there are also researchers that have done more than just interviews. They also do participatory and non-participatory observation if it's required by the research question and the context of the study, right? And the essence of phenomenology, right? We need to be asking the informants to actually committed to explore and share their lived experience, because if they are hesitant and they are holding back on the information, we might not get the best of the quality of the data. So before you try to interview them, you need to actually spend time to explain to them your research framework in simple terms, because not every one of them can actually understand if you are using jargon terms, right? So for the cues in literature, um, well, if you ask me personally this question, phenomenology often look at um individual experiences based on how they view the world, right? But um based on reading many articles, they are also cues of phenomenological study being used in qualitative studies when they are actually mentioning about um, getting this individual experiences as somewhat having similarities at some point. Because usually, when you are doing phenomenology, you are going to adapt some form of thematic analysis, right? So, for you to actually generate or basically uncover emerging themes, you need to actually find a common ground in those differences. So, if you are looking at qualitative papers, they would actually look at the buzzword like bracketing, essence, list experiences, and emerging themes, right? And limits a limitation. Phenomenological does not produce theory. Basically, it has more of a human connectivity and interaction. Therefore, it has more of the emotion rather than building some theoretical background. Okay. The data collection. So in the data collection methods, the most useful in the qualitative in the phenomenology paradigm is basically interviews. And most of the interviews are conducted in semi-structured interviews. But there are also circumstances that unstructured interviews are also used. But a lot of authors or key people in phenomenology advise us to limit unstructured interviews if it's not necessary, just to basically keep the data from being too far away from the direction of the research questions. Because when people tell their side of story or their story about any phenomenon, um, these people tend to be a little bit of a carried away situation. So, from let's say, for example, besides Creswell, if let's say you read Van Manen, that his approach is more of the interpretive, constructive paradigm. He, not to say he won researchers, but he mentioned that there is a need for some structure, because when people actually tell their side of story or their side of experiences without any structure, it tends to be overboard. So, why interviews are often used for phenomenology? Because it allows participants to share their subjective perspective and how that means to them, and what are the emotions that related to the phenomenon under investigation. And then it is also allowing a mix of open-ended questions to share their rich experiences with detailed descriptions. So out of these four data collection methods, interviews are the most popular and will be the main data collection methods that often used in phenomenology. All right. So not to say that um we don't, as phenomenological or phenomenology researcher, not to say that we don't use other methods. It's just that uh the three other methods are often a supplementary methods for us to actually conduct or do some triangulation in the future, or maybe a little bit of the peer review. Basically, these items are accompanying our effort to make sure rigor and trustworthiness happened. So besides interviews, we also conduct observations. Uh, Definitely reflective journals are essential in phenomenology because we need to remind ourselves that we need to avoid biases. So, like I said, for me, because I have too much experience, um, you know, in and outside journalism, so I decide to conduct bracketing, and I use reflecting journals to um reminded me that I shouldn't be interfering with the informant's experiences. And that is basically prevalent in many parts of my reflective journals. Okay, and then we also use other methods such as focus group, artwork creativity, audio video recordings, personal artifacts. And like I said, these other methods are always, if not all the time, um, a supplementary to primarily interviews. For the data analysis, so I have to actually come up with a disclaimer, right? Although the main data analysis technique for phenomenology is thematic analysis, but there are also studies that applies comparative analysis um, in their phenomenological study, depending on your research questions and research um, objectives. Okay, let's say, for example, if you are asking for um, if the main keywords of your first research questions, let's say, for example, what is the lived experience? Okay, I'm actually using my own research questions here to make it easy for me to explain it to you. Let's say, for example, if your questions are related to what is citizen journalism, what is your citizen journalism experiences? What is, right? The first question is what is. your citizen journalism experiences. So, you already know that the how you actually going to collect data is based on multiple response of people, based on how they, or in what way they describe their experiences as citizen journalists. Okay, and the why, let's say for example the question why is, why do you decide to become a citizen journalist? So basically, it should have a detailed answer as to why they decide to become one. And the how in the third question, this is basically based on my thesis. Um, Basically undergone the process, from the initial interest to the actually going for training by CJMY, for example, and then from the training, learn about being a citizen mobile journalism, and then actually writing an article and submitting it, the process. And that is basically you, how the informants describe the um how. So in my study, at least, it won't go as a comparative because we just want to gather all the experiences based on the informant's experience, right? However, in my recent article, because we have done comparison between journalists, not citizen journalists anymore, but journalists in Malaysia and Indonesia, so we decided to go with comparative analysis, using the Berdo theory as our foundation to see in which area that Malaysian journalists versus Indonesian journalism is a little bit different, or is it the same? So, in terms of conducting thematic analysis and comparative analysis, there are some similarities, but for the purpose of actually just mentioning the basics of phenomenology, I will basically concentrate it to the thematic process because that is the most commonly used for phenomenology. So going forward, first we start off with coding and categorization. What is coding? Is basically to put a label in describing a sentence or two that is related to a particular experience within the phenomenon. Let's say, for example, you are labeling the first and second sentence of a transcript by um, factors of citizen journalism interest. Okay, so basically, you are using the sentence that you read to actually label them to provide codes for them. Let's say, for example, right, you wouldn't see the concurrency if you are just doing one interview. But as you go along the coding process, you can find some patterns that actually turn out to be growing, to be rather um, very strong similar patterns that describe the same, not to say the same actual sentence, but the same nuance experiences. So that is why, like after a while, maybe after you read three transcripts or even four, you can see that the coding and categorization become more evident and become more prominent for you to look at whether your coding and categorization is gathering more people that say about the same nuance, even though they are saying it a little bit differently because they experienced this phenomenon of citizen journalism rather individually, right? Because, but as you saw the nuance, the similarity of the nuances, you can realize, you can actually really see that the coding and the categorization help to actually um describe how actually the content of the multiple transcript take shape to help you to start off with the um, theme development, right? So once you can see the pattern from the coding to the categorization, once you build up the interview transcript, you read it out, you found that um there will be emerging themes. And this comes from organizing the data to overarching themes and basically recognizing the patterns. And from these themes, you can look at the connection between the codes and categorization and then see the recurring patterns. And then from the big themes, if your study is big enough, then it will develop into smaller sub-themes. And from this process, you need to do the reduction and abstraction process. So meaning to say, what is reduction and abstraction process? Is the themes that you have emerged, themes that you have developed and emerged from your coding and your category, right? You need to actually look at how these themes can be synthesized and to see whether these emerging themes are actually representing the essential meaning of those individual experiences, right? Um, I would say that a lot of the qualitative papers that I've read, um, particularly from mixed method, I would say that they stop at thematic analysis, right? But for phenomenology, you need to actually go beyond thematic analysis by synthesizing the theme to see if there are meanings that cut across all the individual experiences in terms of similarity, nuances, as well as what are the common grounds. No matter how little or how small it is, there must be something that is particularly evident in that particular phenomenon. For example, once I've done my reduction and extraction process, I found that across the 14, because my number of uh, informants was 14, across the 14 individuals, the abstraction process identifies that across the board, all the citizen journalists didn't care about monetary reward. This is one of the reduction output, for example, right? And then the assassins. Okay, like I said just now, okay, they don't care about the monetary reward as an output. So the essence is basically um to understand how these citizen journalists are actually providing the core understanding as to why they are not interested in monetary gains in doing their citizen journalism journey, right? And last but not least, you need to actually put those into specific structures and describe them to show that you are actually creating a comprehensive understanding of its nature as to why they are not interested in monetary gain. And and those experiences gathered by the 14 people allows you to interpret, depends on their responses as to why they are not interested in monetary gains. That is basically just picking one of the reduction and extraction process out of the menu. Okay, that is just one example. Right. For the trustworthiness and rigor, for qualitative, as you all know, the trustworthiness and rigor techniques are, according to Merriam, right, Sharon Merriam, the process are interchangeable, meaning to say, like, you can use one of these techniques to represent both, but you have to actually display the processes in order for it to be qualified as your method of trustworthiness or rigor. So the one that I usually use for phenomenology is member checking. Basically, I would um after I conduct the first interview, I would give them the transcript and reconfirm with them is that the actual thing that they said, or and this process will basically involve if there are any corrections. And the members checking, at least for my PhD journey, happens 3 times, and it goes across the 14 people that I interviewed as the main data collection person. And then the process itself has to be um described in a thick descriptions. And basically, I remember when I defend my thesis, I have to bring box and box of transcripts, and as a backup, if let's say, and I label them tediously. If let's say they have certain arguments about certain segments, and they can mention who actually speaks that. Let's say, for example, informant one. So basically, all the transcript related to informant one is put into one section of the box versus what happens in informant two until the 14, etc., etc. So yes, I was using Atlas TI for my data analysis, but I also done the actual process rather almost not to say entirely manually, but I have the manual evidence. So towards the very date, what I did was I was printing everything because I learned from my PhD process. My SSCI got crashed 3 times. Not to say I cannot trust the software, but I do feel like I have too many data at the time. And to avoid being double, triple questioned, I decided to kind of like have a backup plan, just to tag almost everything and put it in a box so that I can show the process as well as um, all the items that is related to my thick descriptions. And also, that actually helps the examiners to understand not only the process that I've been through, but also um, show that this research has certain process and it reflects on the trustworthiness and rigor, because the aim of validity and reliability is to show that you are actually conducting the research in a certain process and manner. So besides that, I also rely a lot on my researcher reflexibility, particularly to again and again reminded myself in the process not to perform or any biasness. So I mainly use researcher reflexibility to perform my bracketing efforts. Okay. And I also use reflective process to make sure that their like my findings and their interpretation are grounded in the participant experiences and excluding myself and excluding my experience. And basically, um, it really, really helps if you are conducting any qualitative research to constantly remind yourself if your study design doesn't allow you to be in it, this researcher flexibility will help you a lot in the process. But you have to be very diligent to remind yourself, and actually jot down everything so that it can become the evidences that you are actually trustworthy and rigor in your research process. Okay. And then other strategies, we also use triangulation. In phenomenology, we use also saturation. Saturation, meaning that the point of data that doesn't actually have a new data. Let's say, for example, for my research, after the 14th participant or the 14th informant, I cannot see any new data emerging. So I stop. And that is basically um, saturation. For triangulation, I did not use triangulation for my research because it's too complex. Because as we have known, we have methods triangulation and data triangulation. But after 14 informants and boxes of transcripts, I don't think at that point of time triangulation is the right way for me to go, because otherwise it will take a lot more time, and at that point of time I do not have that much time to complete my PhD. So I dismiss triangulation, but I use other methods, as I said before, in terms of completing my PhD. And also, in these strategies, the qualitative researchers, including those who are applying phenomenology, can actually um, maintain a very detailed documentation of their processes. And this is very, 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 very important, because towards the end of my study, even though audit trail was not included as part of my way to present rigor and trustworthiness at the end, because I have too many documents and I have too much data, my supervisors, Professor Abdul Latif Kraus, actually advised me to also log in an audit trail as to where and how the processes come about. Yeah, so that actually helps with the transparency, because the audit trail actually helps to simplify so that I can show the examiners straightforward as to because if I were to actually, well, I bring my rich data, but because of the Viva session is too limited in terms of time, right? So he actually proposed to me that I should also include audit trail and try to simplify the audit trail so that I can present that as part of my um, Viva presentation. Okay. So application of phenomenology, actually, out of the five most frequent qualitative design that is applicable according to Creswell, phenomenology is the most common research design for qualitative besides case study. And these are the applications for a lot of other areas. So let's say, for example, you are exploring subjective experiences in communication. You can, besides citizen journalism that I have mentioned before, you can also investigate the experience of intercultural communication, cross-cultural communication, internal communication. So it doesn't like really limit, because the thing is like communication itself, it is somewhat of a subjective experience rather than a quantify one, you know, right? And then for communication, it's also allowing the lived experience of storytelling and narrative for, let's say, for example, news or PR campaign, or should I say, uh, TV programs, particularly now, we have like social media, but there are increasing demand for storytelling in social media platforms. So you can actually um, examine that as well using phenomenology, right? Besides the aspect of communication, we can also examine the role of language in constructing reality. Because, let's say, for example, you are speaking a different dialect, and basically how that actually influence your reality, whether it is sad, challenging for you to actually be spoken. Let's say, for example, you are using a particular dialect, and this dialect also influence how you speak in English, for example. Let's say, for example, me in Malaysia, we do have like people coming from different states, like such as Kedah and Kelantan. They do have um their dialect, and their dialect also influences on how they speak their sort of English, right? Um, because of how they speak, right? So this might hinder how they, or this might influence how they construct reality and how successful they are in their communication efforts. So these also, um, you know, come across as how they form their self discovery and how they form their self identity, right? So it basically coincide with psychology as well. And in Malaysia, because I am the also the lifetime member as well as an exco for Malaysia Qualitative Researchers Association, right? So a lot of people in healthcare, particularly if they want to understand the experiences of um, psychological well-being or experiences of patients, they would actually use qualitative or phenomenology in this aspect. As well as I also know there are also a lot of education related um, research that use phenomenology as the hardcore to understand to understand inclusive education, for example, or to understand student motivation for academic success, or basically to understand better teacher-student relationship. Um, and these needs to uh, be based on one person's lived experience and meaning making to make people understand the whole context of the phenomenon. And these process are relatively not necessarily easy, but um, I would say that the applications are more wider now compared to when I was doing my PhD, because nowadays people are doing phenomenology but not limited to just doing interviews and not just doing these domains. They are also doing phenomenological study on creative media platforms. So because they are also doing like um phenomenology but based on the online immersive platforms, because like let's say for example, if you are talking about ethnography, right? So let's say for example they have netnography. So netnography, we need to say you conduct ethnography in the internet. So there are emerging demand for phenomenology to also adapt a more immersive online experience, right? So I do feel that that can be the one direction that phenomenology specifically will go in terms of the evolution of the qualitative research design. Okay. All right.